today for the third of our webinars. As you probably see on your screen, we are recording the webinar today. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which myself and my colleagues at the University of Melbourne work, and they are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And we'd also like to extend our acknowledgement to all First Nations people across the many countries that make up Australia and celebrate their connection to land, water and communities. So on behalf of the University of Melbourne and all attendees today, we honour the cultural heritage and spiritual practices of all First Nations people that continue to shape and enrich our world. We're committed to learning from their wisdom, sharing their knowledge and fostering mutual respect and understanding. So thanks for joining us today for the third and final webinar that we're presenting to you for the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. And I'm joined today by Professor Richard Eckard, Dr. Selwyn Helbron and Associate Professor Tangerine Holt. And between them and myself, we've guided and helped develop and support the university's work in developing the training package for the Carbon Farming Outreach Program. So today's webinar, and Richard was just saying this is all new to him as well, so it's as fresh as you can get. Research on agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation. I've seen the slide deck. I'm excited about this. There's some fantastic content, and we've certainly got the right people in the room to bring you the latest and greatest in this field. So just to briefly mention some of the things that we'll be covering today, Richard's going to talk to you about how the ag research is responding to climate challenges, what's happening in the space and who's doing what. We'll fill you in on some of the startups and what they're doing, and we'll discuss the latest thinking around options and methods for mitigation, and also fill in a little bit on some of the new research on methane inhibitors. So it's a real mixed bag. It's going to be really interesting, and I hope you all get a lot out of it. And as always, we hope and trust that the information that you learned here today will help support your delivery of your services to Australia's farmers and land managers in assisting them and exploring their options for adopting carbon positive farming and management practices. So as in the last couple of webinars, we will have the presentation at the beginning, starting very shortly. We'll take a 10-minute break once we've finished the presentation, and then Richard, Selwyn and the DQ team will be available to answer any of your questions. The best way to do that initially would be to put your questions in the web chat, and then we can go through those. With this webinar, we're going to focus a little more on the Q&A part of this. So please feel free to raise any questions about the webinar itself or any other general information you think you'd like to know about. And we can run through that, and between ourselves and DQ, I'm sure we'll find the answers that you're looking for. As in the last webinars as well, there's an opportunity for you guys to follow up with questions if you like. They would need to be fairly quick. Put those through or direct them through your grantee organisation, and DQ will pass those to University of Melbourne for us to get back to you on. Our engagement with this program finishes at the end of the month, so there's just a short window. So if you do have any follow-up information you require or any support, please direct that through your organisation, and we'll do our best to assist you with that. As I noted earlier, today's webinar is being recorded, and DQ will be circulating that to the grantee organisations for your access and use. And that's about it from me for now, but I'll just pass over to Zoe from DQ for a few words from the department.
Lovely, thanks Ross, and hi everybody and welcome to our third and final webinar. As Ross said, I'm Zoe Booker and I work in the Department of Climate Change. Just a little snapshot about the webinar is that it's intended to provide supplementary information to support you in delivering the CFOP and dives deeper into relevant carbon farming topics. It's not an expectation that you need to walk out of this session with a full technical understanding of the content, but it's just to give you that further information and support based on the topics you've nominated for these webinars to be based on. And as Ross said, we'll have a bit of extra time for Q&A. So if you've got any burning questions on any topic relating to emissions reduction and carbon farming in the ag and land sector, we'll be able to answer them during that time. So, and lastly, just hope you found these sessions informative and useful to your projects, and yeah, look forward to hearing from Richard.
Fantastic. Thanks. Rich, over to you.
Thanks, Ross. Thanks, Zoe. As Ross said, this is new content, so this is the first time I'm sort of test driving it with you. It's just a bit of a roundup of what's happening in research. Now, it's important to understand we're not alone in Australia in doing research in these areas. The whole European Union, I sit on a committee that approves funding into sort of 9 country projects in the EU, in Canada. US was very active until recently, as you can probably understand. I think it's all shutting down. But even Brazil is quite active in this area. We've been doing work in Central Africa on this area that I've personally been involved in. So, and just come back from New Zealand, hearing their entire research program. So it probably means the important bit is for us not to duplicate what other people are doing around the world. And so that awareness and that global connected is really important. So a bit of a roundup of what we're doing in Australia, just talking about 2 of the sort of national initiatives out of the federal government, out of the Commonwealth, around the Merrill program and the CRC. Just explaining what the drivers are of 2 of the pressures that you will encounter, emissions intensity versus net emissions. Just explaining what the drivers are and what the levers are. Then going into enteric methane and nitrous oxide. What is the new research? What are the options? What's the scope of the options? What's new coming through? And then ending up with stacking, which is kind of the next frontier, because no one technology is going to get us to zero. We understand that. Inherently, a farm is a system, and there's multiple levers that you can stack at a farm, but not everything can stack, as you understand. And then we'll hopefully go into a Q&A at the end. So just a quick roundup of what's happening in nationally funded research. This is not a global roundup, which would take us hours to get through. But the methane emissions reduction in livestock Merrill program was one out of the National Livestock Emissions Framework. And stage 1, as you can see there, $5.7 million, 6 projects, funded a lot of focus on Asparagopsis, 3-NOP or Bovie, and the tropical legume Desmanthus. There was also work through Meat and Livestock Australia to look at integrated management and the livestock emissions framework. Stage 2 then said, well, how do we get these technologies out to various grazing properties? How do we, it's fine to have all these supplements, but you can only really feed them in a feedlot or a dairy. Once you're extensive grazing, what's the delivery mechanism? So it looked at lick blocks, loose licks, bolus technology, things like that. And then stage 3 was to validate these delivery technologies. So taking some of the known mitigation options like seaweed, Bovie, 3-NOP, Agolin, Polygain, nitrate. These are all that I'll deal with in a moment. And look at delivery solutions like pellets, liquid supplements, licks, bolus, things like that. And a few reality checks along the way. Like if you had to deliver a Bovie in a bolus for a steer, you would need a 4-kilo bolus. Anyone ever tried to get a 4-kilo bolus down the neck of an animal? I think the biggest Monensin capsule we ever had was 300 grams. So we've had sort of a reset on some of these, these things that are just not practical. Now, probably worth talking about the Net Zero Agriculture CRC as well, where it's one of the biggest investments. It's one of the largest CRCs in history. So if you look at the partner cash, the partner in kind, the Commonwealth funding, $167 million is roughly the cash investment in the CRC. And one of the biggest challenges is keeping 55 industry partners happy. It's almost an impossible job to do that, but it has all the major research universities and state governments involved in delivering solutions. So quite engaging, and I'm one of the program leaders in that CRC. But just briefly, what we're looking at is a typical structure of plant solutions in program 1, animal solutions in program 2, and then I brought in program 3, which said, well, how do we bring this all together and connect it and make sure it's understood in a farm systems context? And then program 4, which says what happens beyond the farm that can help as well. So that's the basic structure, coupled with education and training programs, but also a national network of about 25 demonstration sites that I'll come to in a moment. So this is the plan on a page. I won't go through this in detail because I'm presuming you'll get the notes. And so this is just for your reference to give you a quick snapshot of what we're looking at in program 1, low emissions pastures, fertilizers, legumes, program 2, breeding and slow release delivery, stacking of technologies, bringing it all together in program 3, and program 4, understanding what are the barriers, what are the business models that can be used in addressing these technologies. So won't go through that in detail, but just then we wrap it up in capability development, training, producer demonstration sites, and community outreach. So we'd encourage you to keep pace with what the CRC is going to be doing in the next few years, because it's an opportunity only comes around once in a lifetime. So I thought I'd just start with whatever the target is, because we need to understand that the multinational supply chain companies have set targets, but those are emissions intensity targets largely, whereas state and government targets are absolute targets, or CN30, the red meat target, is an absolute target. So it's quite important to understand what are the drivers of these. And I thought this is something we need to talk about. Emissions intensity is greenhouse gas emissions, tons of emissions per ton of product. So it's a unit for unit measure. And so you've got two levers there, greenhouse gases and tons of product. And if you think of the driver of the calculation in methane, it's can we join the animals earlier? Can we finish them earlier? That reduces their lifetime emissions, but improves the efficiency of the farming operation. Can we increase their growth rate, average daily gain? Can we turn them off quicker? Can we increase lambing percentage? One of the biggest impacts on the calculation in the GAF tools is weaning percentage. If you think of why beef systems in Western Queensland are a 17 and in Northwest Tasmania are a 10, it's just because in Northwest Tasmania, they have 95% weaning. In Western Queensland, they might have 60% weaning. Why is prime lamb a 6 when beef can only get to a 10? Well, beef can't get above 100% weaning, whereas prime lamb can get to 101.5, 150% weaning, 1.5 lambs per ewe. It's just changing the denominator. So some of the tools then would be around breeding, selection of more efficient animals, selection for greater fertility, reproduction, everything that we've been communicating to livestock producers for the last 20, 30 years. Improves emissions intensity, improving nutrition, better forage quality, better grazing management, better legumes, better animal health. One study I was just involved in that we've wrapped up and published is, what if we could treat all the sheep in East Africa for roundworm? What's the savings in methane? Turns out it's massive. Just an animal health intervention in making animals more efficient has a massive impact on their emissions intensity. In terms of nitrous oxide, it's a bit more simple. It's nitrogen use efficiency and yield. How do you get more yield for the same input of resources? How do you get more crop production from the same amount of nitrogen? Can we pull back on the diminishing returns response curve to nitrogen to get more nitrogen use efficiency? And so your key management interventions there are best practice, nitrogen BMPs from your industry. Every industry in Australia now has nitrogen best practices for dairy, for sugar, for cotton, for grains. But it's also about improving yield, which would be genetic solutions, better plant genetics, better growth rates, better early maturing varieties, for example. Soil nutrition and organic matter all play a role. So these are things that should be fairly easy to communicate to farmers, because these things on the page all make them money. They will all make them more efficient as producers. if you look at net emissions, this is tons of emissions per farm or per animal or per hectare. So it's an absolute value. So you've got drivers of the calculation for methane is absolute reductions in methane. Let me just see what, yeah. And so your key management interventions are breeding for residual methane production, which I'll come to in a moment, inhibitors, vaccines, supplements, secondary compounds, early life programming. This is stuff I'm going to come to in the next few slides, so I won't go into too much detail here. For nitrous oxide, it comes back to best practices of rate, source, timing, placement of nitrogen fertilizer. But we now introduce two others. Nitrogen formulation, which is about coated fertilizers that can reduce nitrous oxide or reduce ammonia loss. So we don't just have the 4 R's, we've got 5 R's now. Formulation becomes important. One thing that of late has become quite important in some of the calculations is understanding placement, because there's some industries that are able to place their nitrogen or place their nitrogen at the base of each tree. An example would be the mango industry in Fog Dam in Northern Territory, where they talk of mangoes needing 60 kilos of N per hectare, but only 6 kilos effectively applied, because you've got the 60 applied at the base of the tree, which actually means you've only applied, the tree sees 60, but the per hectare is 6. So you've saved 1 decimal place in the amount of nitrogen put per hectare, because you're not fertilizing areas that are not relevant to the tree. Simple things like that, and cotton is a good example of that. But one other that I'll deal with is nitrogen sourcing, which has become quite prevalent as well, because we know where you buy your nitrogen from has a big impact on the pre-farm emissions embedded in the nitrogen. So now that we've established that, let's go on to options for mitigation. This is a diagram that I first put out in 2010 and have just updated it now, but not much has changed in our thinking, where you've got 3 categories for enteric methane. You've got animal manipulation. So can we change the health, fertility, weaning rates, improve emissions intensity through better fertility? And then there's breeding for lower methane, and in particular, effective breeding values that are about to come through in the next 12 to 18 months through the CRC research program. And these will be breeding values that replace current sustainability indices in industry that will allow you to select for residual methane production. Now, what the simplest way to explain that is it's reducing luxury methane above what you would expect. In other words, you're selecting for animals that only produce the exact amount of methane that is relevant rather than luxury. That's the best way to explain it in short. So you're not actually restricting animal production, you're just looking for an animal that is not losing as much energy as its neighbor. Then there's diet manipulation, oils, essential oils, secondary compounds and chemicals. All of these have some products in the marketplace like cottonseed oil, cold pressed canola, grape mark. Under essential oils, 2 products in the marketplace, Agolin and Mutrail. Fair bit of evidence around those at the moment. Secondary compounds that I'll come to, like better legumes in our pastures that have these secondary compounds, like Desmanthus and Lucina have got tannin in them that reduces methane. Sugarcane extract that has a polyphenolic compound in it called polygain. Lucerne that has a secondary compound in it called a saponin, which is often found in soft drinks, ironically, but it reduces methane. And then there's chemicals. Did you know that the statins that you might be taking for heart disease actually can reduce methane because they inhibit the enzyme process in the methanogenesis process? So statins might not just be for humans in future, who knows? And then rumen manipulation. Inhibitors like the statin, but like the seaweed and the Bovier and some new ones coming through. Vaccination, mRNA technology that was developed under COVID has now become quite important in rolling out vaccines for livestock and early life programming. So let's delve into a few of these just quickly. There's a lot of, one of the programs in the CRC is around breeding targets and can we produce effective breeding values for the beef, sheep, and dairy industries in selecting for this trait, residual methane production. And you can see in the diagram on the right there that there's a variance in the population of how much methane is produced by animals. And so there is potential to select for animals on the left-hand side of that normal distribution, to shift the normal distribution to the left and end up with less methane. And this is quite important because it's cumulative and permanent as a trait. And so watch out for these EBVs coming through. In the dairy industry, it's quite likely that it will replace the current sustainability index with a EBV that reduces methane. If you're looking at secondary compounds, there's two papers that are out now. One, I was involved in both of them with a national team of collaborators, where we looked at temperate legumes and tropical legumes more recently. So the tropical legume one is in review at the moment, about to come out. And both of these have looked at the potential for existing legumes that have tannins in them. So that would be tannins like crown vetch, lotus, Bicerillus, ceridella, and I can think of desmanthus and leucaena in the north. These are all potentials. Or saponins, like lucerne has got saponin content in it, so it can reduce emissions that way. There's a bit of interest in some of the existing brassicas that have high sulfate content. So there's a fair bit of work still to be done to bring those through, because the genes do exist and can be selected for high sulfate brassicas. And then New Zealand's about to release a high ME ryegrass. This is a high energy ryegrass, but it's actually a high lipid ryegrass. The reason why it's got more energy is because it's got a higher fat content in it, and we know that fats reduce methane. So there's some technologies, and you can see where we're headed here with the research is saying, can we pick existing candidates that have already got an adoption profile and just see if we can improve their saponin content in existing lucerne? So last year you bought lucerne that didn't reduce methane, and next year you buy it that does reduce methane. That's the idea. Last year you bought traditional ryegrass, next year you buy a high lipid content ryegrass, and methane goes down as a result. So this tries to address the adoption issue around new technologies. What we know in the conclusion of these papers is this genotype diversity can be exploited. So picking existing legumes, but needing a more detailed understanding of what these actually do in the potential to reduce emissions, and remembering actually rediscovering legumes as a primary impact of reducing emissions by just growing animals faster. If you improve legume content in an existing grass pasture, you will just increase growth rate and animals will leave to market earlier. Turns out that actually is probably the biggest impact that legumes can have. Then on top of that, they can have an impact of reducing methane for every day the animals are there, but actually the animals are just there for less time. So that's where the real impact is. We've just done a full review of early life programming, and this is really exciting because what this review suggested is there's not just one way to achieve this. There's various methods, each of which have their own merit. So instead of saying, well, there's only one way to do this, and if that fails, we're not going to be able to program animals to produce less methane. There's methods around step-down weaning, around increasing the propionate, producing taxa, using antimethanic supplements, and what we call transformation, all have different ways of intervening in the animal to reduce its inherent methane production. And then we identified different timings of intervention. So there's intervention in fetal programming, in other words, pre-parturition, long before the animal, the cow gives birth. We've actually set the animal on a low profile and profile of methane, so the calves and the lambs inherit a low methane profile. And then there's post-parturition, which is about immune transfer. So can we reduce the cholesterol transfer? And then post-weaning through inhibitors. This is a rich area of research, and there's at least 2 projects in the CRC. There's at least another one in New Zealand and one in the European Union, all looking at ways in which we can intervene. Because this is the ultimate goal, is can we intervene in a way that is perpetual and inheritable into the next generation, instead of asking farmers to spend money on a daily dose of some inhibitor. It would have to be a better way to go. There are new products in the marketplace. If you look at some of these, there's Agolin based on essential oils. We've known about essential oils for a long time, but we didn't think there would be cost-effective essential oils available to agriculture, because every other commercial application wants access to essential oils. But leave it to the private sector, and they come up with ways in which to extract garlic and citrus oil and come up with byproducts like Agolin ruminant, which does reduce methane. And there's a meta-analysis there if you want to go and dig up the results. That's just surveying all the research on Agolin around the world and coming up with about a 13% decrease in methane with an increase of about 4% of fat and protein corrected milk. Mootrail is another product that's been in the marketplace for a while and has some evidence around it. Probably again around a 20%, 15 to 20% reduction in methane. Again, made out of essential oils. Both of these products have evidence around increased productivity as well as reduction in methane, so technically can pay for themselves. We've just finished some work on Polygain, which is an extract from sugarcane, which has also been shown to reduce methane in beef cattle and dairy cattle. We've done one experiment in beef, one in dairy. Again, another product that is likely to increase productivity, so watch the space. So I am talking about product coming through in the next short while. Some Agolin and Mootrail are available. Polygain is about to be released. We've heard a lot about the vaccine program. And to be fair, the vaccine program started over 20 years ago in CSIRO in Western Australia. Back then, it was very much in early days of understanding what they were actually targeting. Whereas the research now from AgResearch in New Zealand has really ramped it up and said, can we identify common surface proteins that are common to all the methanogen species? And it's a bit like the COVID vaccine, saying there's a surface protein that's common. Can we target a vaccine to that surface protein? And that way, you get all the methanogens, not just the dominant families that are there. Because you don't want to knock out the top hierarchy and just let the next hierarchy come up and take their place. What's happened more recently is there's been a dramatic increase in investment in this area now that mRNA technology has come along. But we've also seen the Global Methane Hub secure money out of the Gates Foundation and out of the Bezos Earth Fund. So there's significant philanthropic investment going into a global strategy around methane vaccines. So we are likely to see in the next 18 months a vaccine emerge that can achieve somewhat around 20% initially, and then a few years later, something that can double that as its efficacy. So watch this space, very much hot off the press in research at the moment. The 20% vaccine is likely to come out of the bottom row of investors in New Zealand, the New Zealand Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Research Centre and AgResearch New Zealand. I thought I'd show you some examples of startups. Now, this is where I'd probably suggest some critical thinking on your part, because the moment you have a priority like we've got to reduce methane, you get a lot of startups. Now, there's no judgment about any of these startups. I'm just giving you examples of promising startups that seem on the surface to be promising. But I get approached on a weekly basis by someone who's got a new miracle cure for methane. And you've got to approach each one of them on first principles to say, what are they offering? Is it got any chance of working, or is this just another fly-by-night? So just a bit of critical thinking. Number 8 Bio is looking at, well, can we engineer microbes to create bromoform, for example? Very promising. There's another company we've been talking to for a while called Meth AI. And this is a really interesting, it's based on the idea that all the dairy cows in Israel have been fully genomically profiled. They've got a metagenomic analysis of every cow in Israel. And it gives you the ability to actually use AI to customize a diet that maximizes methane reduction for a target population. And so they're able to identify for this dairy herd and its genetic makeup, we can target these 3 supplements that can actually have the biggest impact on methane. Very interesting area of research. Ruminate, a company in Australia, in Western Australia, that said, well, do we need to grow all the seaweed in seaweed farms? Can we just synthesize bromoform as the pure product and feed that? Able to feed bromoform at a far more cost-effective rate than growing seaweed in seaweed farms. Maybe that's the solution. Rome Agricultural is using a fungal enzyme to produce bromoform, and looking at controlled inhibitor release products through fungal enzymes. So at least 3 of those are focused around bromoform. And then Zell, interesting company, zero emissions livestock production. And 5 years ago, we met up with them and they developed this device that can hang around a cow's neck and oxidize methane as the animal breathes out. So initially it started out as a device where we can reverse the methane as the cow breathes out, we can turn it back to CO2. Then they discovered actually they are also measuring methane and probably could make more money out of selling a device that measures methane. So now the whole company has pivoted to supplying a device that actually can be maybe on 10% of the animals in your herd or flock that can quantify the methane produced by the animals, rather than actually oxidize the methane. So like I said, this is for example, not for endorsement. These are the ones I'm aware of, but I'm also aware of probably another 20 companies that we've engaged with that are all in the early stages of concept development. So watch this space, the solutions are rolling through. There is also some new research on methane inhibitors that I thought I should highlight. Bromoform, because it's quite a strident chemical, the active ingredient out of seaweed, there's probably 2 things to test the water. New Zealand is saying, well, let's put it out for Codex listing. If it can pass the US Codex listing, then obviously it's passed all the safety tests that are needed in the marketplace to make sure that we've done all the due diligence. And that's really important because New Zealand's hit the wall before on chemicals that have been picked up in milk in target countries that haven't appeared on the Codex list. So getting it on the Codex list is the next due diligence to make sure this is a safe product to go into the supply chain. And some of the work we're doing at the Ellenbank Dairy Research Centre and in collaboration with CSRO is saying, well, it's not about bromoform because it can be any form of bromide in the animal. Can we close that bromide balance? We know we stuck it in. Where did it go? We say bromoform is not in the meat and milk, but actually we put it in, so where did it go? And only once we've added up all the points in the animal as to where it actually landed up as a chemical bromide, then we can make statements about the true impact of the chemical. That's not a positive or negative statement. It's just saying it's due diligence about closing the bromide balance. So watch the space. We're about to finish that work, which would have an implication on what we can say about the Codex listing associated with bromoform. There's also a lot of research now going on saying, can we take these inhibitors and release them in a slow release form? So if you're a Northern Territory cattle producer that doesn't know where your animals are, we know that they go for water every day. And so is water delivery a key to getting it released in those environments? Or is it about the fact that the animals come to the water trough once a day and there's a lick block sitting next to the water trough and they have a lick at the lick block at least every second day? Can we put it as a biodegradable polymer embedded in the lick block? And therefore they get their slow release dose that way. Question mark after bolus, because of the earlier statement I said, if you're looking at a payload to last for at least 6 months, you're looking at a couple of kilos, which is more than you can get down the throat of an animal as a bolus. So let's be practical about it. It might actually be microscopic, a biopolymer embedded chemical that you put into a lick block that can then, it's not about a bolus, it's about slow release delivery from a every second day lick of a lick block. And then there's new inhibitors. that are coming through from New Zealand, from Australian research, from European research. Hedging adaptation is going to be really important. And you've heard me say before, this rumen environment took 50 million years to evolve. It's not like something that happened overnight. And we see adaptation happening all the time. And so there's a very real risk that if we back bromoform and 3-NOP or Bovier as our two inhibitors, that in a year's time after commercial use, we find animals adapting to these products. And so it's the same as anyone who's dosed animals for worms. You never use the same worming treatment twice in a row because you get adaptation. We need more inhibitors in the marketplace so we can switch between products to avoid adaptation. That's going to be part of the course in the future. Let's switch on to nitrous oxide and a similar diagram saying the things we can do around animal management, breeding animals that are more efficient, around changing the diet of the animal. Some of the biggest impact you can have on reducing urinary nitrogen excretion from livestock is just getting the energy to crude protein ratio right. Crude protein to metabolizable energy. Get that ratio right and you've saved a lot of urinary nitrogen. And legumes can achieve some of that by offering a better protein quality as well. Then I mentioned rate, source, timing, formulation, placement in horticulture, but also manufacture. Can we source more benign sources of nitrogen in future? And then obviously the soil management around reducing compaction, anaerobicity in the soil, irrigation management. So let's just go through a few of these. This is already starting to play out. Some of you would have heard me mention it, where we now know that from the EcoInvent database, we've calculated that the average pre-farm emissions embedded in urea brought into Australia differs depending where we buy it. And so we've got one of our major companies in Western Australia buying preferentially the Canadian urea, and with it comes a lower inherent pre-farm scope 3 footprint. Great. Why don't we do it? It's something we can do already. But I do think the future is on-farm green ammonia, where a quick search will show you these companies, and you'll get these notes so you can go back and check them out for yourself. There's at least 6 companies now already operating in Australia as startups, saying we can generate ammonia using solar energy or renewable energy or green hydrogen based in your local town as a depot, or based on farm using surplus solar on your farm. I'd send you to Sundown Pastoral to have a look at their ammonia production they're doing out of a solar farm. So have a look at these technologies. Jupitertronics was one that we had a hand in saying, could we use surplus solar in the cotton industry to generate enough green hydrogen to power the Haber-Bosch process to generate ammonia? Turns out you can do that at small scale. So if you want a way in which we can solve the pre-farm footprint, but also disconnect nitrogen fertilizer from the fossil fuel price, which in the future is going to be quite critical for the future of the use of nitrogen fertilizer in agriculture, this is the way forward. There's also a need for more research. Here's a good example where we came to the conclusion that the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory was using a mismatch of international or European Union emission factors for crop residues. So all crop residues, all the nitrogen in crop residues multiplied by 1%, as opposed to fertilizer emission factors that were literally half or a quarter of that. And so we've already put in research. GRDC and Queensland University of Technology are doing research on crop residues to come up with more locally appropriate factors. And the impact it has, just when we made the inventory aware of this and were able to switch from the 1% to the 0.5% that we currently have, so we've adopted a low emission factor by reducing it from 1% to 0.5%, that took about 20% out of the average grains farm emission profile just by getting the crop residue factor right. So you can see the massive impact that just doing research has on carbon accounting and what we are liable for in agriculture. So that research, watch this space. The other research that's been done is saying, can we come up with more regionally appropriate emission factors? And this is the latest series of emission factors that we've come up with as a result of the National Nitrous Oxide Research Program. This is what's now embedded in the greenhouse gas inventory. And if you think about where we came from in 2002, I think 2003, that was just 1.25% across the board. All fertilizer put on in Australia was 1.25% times nitrogen, whereas now we've got a far more nuanced approach to that, and we'll continue to do that. But it goes even further, because in the same publication from Peter Grace, we saw that if you then switch from conventional urea to coated urea with DMPP, which is one of the many nitrification inhibitors, look at how those numbers drop. And so on average, that would be about a 70% reduction in nitrous oxide if we adopted coated fertilizers. Now, not cost effective currently, because the productivity gains for farmers are not great. But we already know that if everyone moved, all 20 fertilizer companies moved from not coating to coating, the unit cost will come from 14% price premium down to about 4% price premium. So if we had a move towards coating all fertilizers that we use, the price would only be a 4% price premium on current nitrogen fertilizer, and we'd drop all cropping emissions by about 40% just by doing coated fertilizers. Then there's other things around getting the energy to protein ratio right in the animal. So if we move away from fertilizers for a moment to just the dairy industry, for example, or the feedlot industry, where we actually feed far too much protein in these industries. There's a bit of hedging that goes on. And so typically a cow that needs 18% crude protein for maximum dairy production could be getting 25% crude protein in their diet. If you just pulled that back to the right ratio, this study that we looked at, if you look on the right there, just changing the diet and changing the milk nitrogen, which is the more effective of the two. And it turns out just getting the energy to protein ratio right in the diet can save you an order of magnitude more in greenhouse gas emissions from excess urinary nitrogen than trying to breed an animal that partitions more into milk. The New Zealand government just finished a 6-year research experiment on this, and in the end of 6 years, they came to the same conclusion as we did in our modeling study here. Let's just feed the animal right. Now, this brings us on to stacking of mitigation options. And what I've tried to do here is give you a way in which we should start thinking about this. And this is a paper we're developing through the CRC that will come out fairly soon, saying one thing lacking in a lot of the research we've done to date is not understanding which options combine with which options in a logical way. And so to start thinking about enzyme inhibitors, well, there's no point in feeding bovia and bromoform to the same animal at the same time because they're doing the same thing. So logic says don't feed them. It's one of the two, not both. But it does say if you're feeding bromoform, you can add oils on top. So bromoform might reduce the methane by 50%. But because it's got a different mode of action to oils that reduce actual methanogenesis, you can actually get 70% by adding oils on top of bromoform. And so then we're starting to get to the point of understanding the stacking of these options. The vaccine, for example, that will just reduce the number of methanogens in the rumen of an animal. So you can actually give an animal a vaccine, and then on top of that, give it bromoform to reduce methane further. And on top of that, give it an oil to reduce methane further. But there's no point in combining options that have the same mode of action. This is the more complex form of the same diagram, and I'll leave it for your reference because it's something that some of you might want to pour some time over. But I presented this to the New Zealand conference recently, and it was the first time anyone had seen this kind of information, because scientists are great at reductionist thinking. They'll say, and I'm a scientist, so I blame myself too. We're great at saying, let's feed this animal on oils, and oh, we got a 50% reduction, but not think about the stacking of that and the mode of action and why that worked at a systems level. And so what I've done here is taken all the options in green and broken them into mode of action in red. So enzyme inhibitors, statins are enzyme inhibitors. So you can actually couple them with oils and essential oils. You could feed starch to an animal and feed bromoform and get a doubling up of the efficacy. So essentially, if you wanted to stack, you can pick products in the green as long as they fall into a separate category on the red, and they will stack. But don't think that you can pick. Give you an example. We fed tannins with oils in grape marc. So you would have heard of the research we did on grape marc. And the way it worked is because the grape marc has got an oil in it and a tannin in it, we were thinking we would get a double up. But actually what happened is feeding oil on its own gave us 15%. Feeding tannin on its own gave us 15%. When we put the two together, we got 20%. We didn't get 30% because we were following down the same red line there. Instead of picking one from a completely different pathway from that second tier onwards. Does that make sense? Just saying, if you're thinking about options, this is a very useful diagram to say, when we're looking at reducing methane, these are stacking options. So this is hot off the press as a way of thinking about the future. We can do the same with nitrous oxide and say, well, there's urinary pathways, and they would split into balancing energy to protein ratios or nitrification inhibitors. There's nitrogen formulation, which would be urease inhibitors, nitrification inhibitors. There's best practice, which would be rate, source, timing, placement of nitrogen. And those all have different flow-on effects as to how you get there. I'll just pick two interesting ones in the first box. There's a protocol we've just approved in the United States that is about just feeding a higher lysine supplement to existing animals, recognizing that actually lysine is the missing amino acid in ensuring quality protein digestion by the animal. So if you feed an unbalanced protein, you're likely to get more urinary nitrogen than if you feed a balanced protein. The missing ingredients seem to be lysine, so putting lysine in dramatically dropped urinary nitrogen excretion in these animals. And so just something simple like balanced amino acid nutrition, or having the right amount of energy in the pasture you feed to match the protein you've got in the diet, dramatically reduces urinary nitrogen excretion. And so that's something that we can practically do right now by bringing in better legumes, lower protein to energy ratios, putting more grain in the diet. So for example, in the dairy industry in New Zealand, they've got a severe problem because they don't have the ability to feed grain like we do in Australia. So in Australia, in a dairy, we can bring in more energy to match the excess protein and get that diet balanced as a result. I thought I'd end up by showing some of the practicality of where this is going to be rolling out now in the future. And through the Net Zero Agriculture CRC, we've got a whole network of demonstration sites around the country. One hub in each state, linked to about 5 farms around each of those hubs. So whenever you see a red circle there, a red tick, there's going to be one central farm with about 5 farms hanging off it, demonstrating individual technologies. And so on these, we'll be taking these mitigation options and actually demonstrating them in a research context, and then taking it out to a farm where we can then actually measure using green feed units to measure methane, nitrous oxide chambers, flux towers to measure carbon. And so watch this space. These are all being set up as we speak. Just to finish off, I think it's obvious there's no silver bullet. There's silver buckshot is the term we use. It's going to understand the mechanism and take a whole farm approach. And zero might not be possible, but net zero is achievable. So thanks. It's either Zoe or Haley that I'll hand back to.
Thanks for that, Rich. That was very informative. There's an amazing amount of information there, and it's so exciting to see just how quickly the research and development is accelerating in the area. So thank you very much. Zoe, is there anything you'd like to add to that before we go on a break?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you, Richard. Really insightful. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So as I mentioned before, we'll have a 10-minute break. If you like, take the opportunity to pop some questions in the chat and we can start going through those when we come back. And yeah, so we'll open the floor up for questions, and remember that it's not just about this particular topic today. If you have other questions about the program that you think we might be able to help you with, then feel free to ask those as well. So we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes time. Thank you. Start off with those, and Phil, if we can start recording, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, do you want me just to get straight into Simon's questions to start with?
That would be great.
So if everyone's looking at the chat, Simon's interested in urea production, ideas about production of urea from biomass. I'm going to have to break that down a little in that, you know, you can't produce urea directly from biomass, but you can actually use biomass to generate syngas through biochar formation, and syngas can be used to power the production of urea. That's probably the only connection I can see between biomass and urea. Urea is essentially, if you think about it, it's first you go through the Haber-Bosch process to create ammonia as a molecule. And then you have to bind that ammonia with a bicarbonate molecule, which usually comes out of firing the ammonia with methane gas. And that's how you produce urea. It's two ammonias linked by a bicarbonate in the middle. So it's not an automatic thing from biogas unless you are using biomass to generate syngas that can then hydrogen power the process. I hope that makes sense, Simon. Residues to avoid emissions by converting through to biochar. Yeah, look, there's a fairly biochar is a possibility. One way to say it. Some of the things that hung me up on biochar was when policy said that the person who converts it in the pyrolysis plant is who owns the carbon credit. And I thought not many farmers own the pyrolysis plant. It's usually a commercial business who's then going to own, because if you think about this labile organic matter that then gets converted to recalcitrant carbon, where that occurs is where the credit accrues, where you've gone from something that can go back to the atmosphere to something that won't go back to the atmosphere. And so any carbon credit doesn't accrue to the farmer that land applies it. It's accrued at the pyrolysis plant. That was only the sort of policy hang up I had about it, not whether it was a good thing to do or not. The other thing you would want to do is biochar is probably only suitable where the organic matter is a genuine surplus. What I mean by that is a lot of crop residues just should go back to the system they came from to maintain the soil organic matter in the status that it should be. And so we shouldn't think of wheat residue, wheat stubble as being an automatic candidate for biochar, because you might impoverish the soil of the organic matter it needs. Whereas the best I ever saw for biomass, for biochar, is urban waste. You know, those green bins that get collected. You've got a pile of it sitting here in the Yarra Valley, tons of organic matter sitting there, and that's almost the best case you could imagine for biochar. So a bit of swings and roundabouts there with biochar. It has its place.
Could I give an example of where?
Yeah, sure.
Rainbow Bee Eater, which started in WA, has got a couple of plants where they're producing syngas to heat glass houses, and they're using, in one case, spare timber from waste timber from Melbourne, and in the other some straw and other material. The biochar goes back onto the property somehow, and the credits accrue to the production of the biochar, as you say, and they're sold for $300 a tonne to voluntary systems in elsewhere for people like Spotify and others. And it's quite an interesting example, but the credits don't come to Australia. They go over there.
Yeah, it must be a voluntary carbon market method, because the compliance markets don't have that method yet. Yeah, okay. So there's an example of where it can be useful, because you not only the syngas is replacing a fossil fuel gas in heating, obviously. So there's a savings in energy there. The land application, it depends on the quality of the biochar that went in. So if you're putting in timber waste, the biochar that comes out is quite impoverished. It doesn't have much agronomic value. Whereas if you put in something that's got a reasonable amount of potassium and nitrogen, like the wheat straw could have 1.5% nitrogen, you can get some value out of the biochar. So rubbish in, rubbish out, basically is the answer there. Sarah, yes, there's a recording which you can get access to. I think Zoe answered your question. Is stacking being assessed in grain production? Nick, unfortunately, not, but the last flow diagram I produced is the closest we've got. So you can see stacking in terms of, because the major emissions from the grain production system is going to be nitrogen fertilizer, you can see a stacking option being, firstly, where you buy the nitrogen from. If you buy from Canada, you've dropped 20% of your scope 3 emissions straight away. Then if you adhere to rate source timing placement, that is entirely compatible with coated fertilizers as a third option. So straight away, you've got a stacking of 3 options that can, if you add all 3 of those together, our scenarios would say you've dropped 60% of the emissions out of your grain system. That's true stacking. So there is some logic in nitrogen stacking, because you're intervening at different points in the cycle. So I'd say it's less complex in the grains industry than it is in the, where it would get complex in the grains industry is around internal nitrogen use efficiency and breeding of plants. That would be difficult to unpick. But if you're just talking about fertilizer use, coated fertilizers, and fertilizer sourcing, entirely stackable. Yeah, so Nick, your question on how changes in enterprise mix impacts the farm footprint, that's a bit of what the CRC demo sites are going to do, because it's a complex question that's very poorly answered at the moment. There is simplistic views that say, if you go out of sheep production into canola in Western Victoria, you will save all these greenhouse gas emissions because there's no methane anymore. It's just that the land use change will produce so much nitrous oxide and CO2 out of oxidizing soil carbon that it'll probably be 20 years of crop production before you actually have a net savings in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's not simple. You take a 30-year-old sheep pasture and you plow it up to put in a crop, or you disturb it to put in a crop, you release massive amounts of nitrous oxide and CO2 in that soil disturbance. That would have to be discounted from the next decade of crop production. So I suspect that we're probably going to see a more of a mixed farming systems approach coming into inland Australia, just from an adaptation and resilience point of view. So it might have nothing to do with emissions, and it might have more to do with hedging your bets between more than one production system. Sarah, is any work being done on nitrogen fertilizer use and correlated liming to counteract pH? Nice to overlay the dollars. Yeah, Sarah, unfortunately, there's there's an obvious connection, because the more nitrogen fertilizer you put on, the more lime you need to counteract the acidity you created with the nitrogen fertilizer. That's probably overlooked in well-buffered soils, where the connection to pH change is not obvious until it's too late. And you've got to remember, pH is a logarithmic scale. So if you drop 0.1, you need 1 ton of lime. If you drop 0.2, you need 10 tons of lime. So often it's too late by the time you realize you've shifted pH and it's now costing you 10 tons. So there does need to be a calibrated approach. What we did in the dairy industry is say, if you're using 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year in fertilizer, you need to proactively apply 2.5 tons of lime every 5 years to counteract that. That was kind of best practice recommendation about proactive liming if you're going to be dependent on nitrogen fertilizer. It really, most of it is driven by the movement of nitrate down the profile. So in some of your more arid grain regions, that's probably less of an impact than in some of your higher rainfall industries, where the cause and effect of too much nitrogen will drive acidity fairly quickly. Again, Sarah, when will the exact closest towns of demonstrations be released to the public? Interesting question about those industries. I'd probably say we need to go back to each of their websites, because it was just that when I trawled through their websites, some were offering to deliver a shipping container to your farm, like Tronics, Jupiter Tronics would just deliver a shipping container and a solar farm, and it would all happen in the shipping container and produce liquid ammonia. Whereas some of the technologies, just by their very nature, they would be better at a central location where you can get the volume required through passive ammonia production. So I don't know if any of them have case studies out yet. I just put that together the other day when I saw someone refer to one or two of these companies. I thought, let's see how many there are, and came up with that list. So that's a little bit of hot off the press. To go back to an earlier one that Simon came up with, saw a reference to insetting to create farm carbon neutrality as a preferred practice to offsetting, that this process does not consideration of additionality. That's exactly right, Simon. I'm quite involved in insetting methodologies in the United States. So I sit on a reference group to a company that offers major insetting, and we've seen farmers in the US being paid $9 million for insetting just last year alone by their supply chain that want to buy low emissions product. Now, the thing about insetting is we don't care when you did it. All we care about is, are you a 10 or a 15? Because if you're a 15, then you might be the average of your industry. If you're a 10, don't care about the units, just an example. If you're a 10, then we know you're 50% lower emissions from the district average, and therefore you have already contributed a 50% gain towards your supply chain's targets. So let's assume your supply chain have set a 30% target. They're going to buy all the 10s first. And so this insetting group are actually coming up with ways in which to quantify the fact that you're a 15 versus a 10, and preferentially buy the 10, or reward the 10 with a carbon value equivalent. So that's already happening. But you can see that if you're monetizing a carbon credit, then additionality is really important, because we don't want to be allocating carbon credits for stuff that's happening in anyway. But if you are insetting, whether you're a 10 as of yesterday or 10 as of 10 years ago, nobody cares. You are already providing your supply chain with a lower number.
Raise that, because when we actually get to talk to farmers, the insetting, when you change hands or you sell your property, you're not necessarily requiring that new owner to look after a process which might go on for another 25 years.
Yeah, so to clarify, most insetting groups are running scared of sequestration for that reason.
Yeah.
So they're only dealing with actual emissions intensity or absolute emissions. Both are tradable, because it depends on what the value chain want to buy. If your target is emissions intensity based, you want the 10. You don't care when they achieve the 10, and there's no residual obligation. So I was at the Australian Dairy Conference the other day and met a farmer from Wisconsin who had been paid $250,000 for insetting by having adopted a new manure management system on the farm. That was it.
Yeah.
If they don't do it next year, it doesn't matter. If they sell the farm, it doesn't matter. That's history. It just is. They've sold the reduction in methane that happened last calendar year.
Yeah.
It has no bearing on the next calendar year as to what happens, whereas sequestration really does impact on the future and the price of the property and all that. So fundamental difference. So you could probably argue that in insetting markets, permanence and additionality are not major criteria.
Thank you.
Nick, so we're working through all those CRC demo sites. You can imagine the ones in the north of Australia will be very much around rotational grazing or best practice grazing management, because they are rangeland sites. As you come down into better watered areas, there'll be some that are more focused on cropping. The one we looked at in northeast Victoria the other day was looking at a new move towards integrated rotations in cropping that go through wheat cropping into pasture for a few years with sheep rotating. So the question that was asked earlier by Sarah, I think, trying to quantify the whole nitrogen and carbon and methane cycle associated with going from a wheat on wheat system into a wheat livestock legume rotation. So that'll be really interesting from our point of view to understand the full implications for the carbon and nitrogen cycle. Nick, some of those in Western Australia could be tanning, for example, where again you do have that livestock sheep cropping interaction that might be happening at that site as well. And then there's a First Nations site up in the Kimberley that we'll be looking at as well, which is more around integration of traditional values into livestock production systems. So really interesting. If I've missed any, I don't know if anyone's tracking, Ross, if I've missed any of the questions.
No, not at this point. No, we're on track. But I would say to anyone who's with us, please feel free to unmute yourself and put your camera on if you'd like to ask Rich a question, or any of the DQ team or University of Melbourne team. Please feel free to.
Sarah, yeah, the demo sites are currently being contracted. They've all been identified and approved, and Mick Taylor, if those of you might know Mick, is contactable through the Net Zero CRC. He manages all the demo sites. Initially, there'll be one key site per state that is fully instrumented. So that's got all the gizmos on it. And then there'll be component sites that'll come later on that'll hang off those sites. So to find your local site in your local region, that map I showed you is the first cut that we've got. But Mick Taylor can put you in touch with the local teams, because each state will have a CRC coordinator, a demo site coordinator that'll look after the one or two hubs with all the spokes, and be the industry comms connection person that'll organize field events and things. So to find who that person is in each state, they haven't been appointed yet, but some of them have been identified.
So Rich, on that point, is there a mix across various ag sectors, areas of ag, with those farms focus on, or are they predominantly in one particular type of practice?
No, they mixed. You'll have rangeland grazing in the north. In Queensland there will be mixed cropping with grazing. In New South Wales there'll be one demonstrating high tannin legume pastures, for example. The one in Victoria will be mixed cropping livestock. And possibly those of you who know Western Australia, logical if tanning was one of the sites that would be mixed as well. There's one in Tasmania. I think there's a veggie growing one there. So yeah, probably the lightest would be in horticulture. So you could probably say there's a bias towards grazing beef, sheep, and cropping would probably be the majority.
Thank you. It's great to see that there's a spread?
Nick's been challenged by an agronomist on assumptions of nitrous oxide emissions. Nick, I presume we update the calculators as soon as the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory accepts new research. So one of the keys to the national standard that's emerging is it has to always be consistent with the IPCC approved methodology for Australia. So we would love to have a model in there that dynamically predicts exactly how much nitrous oxide is coming out of your system. But you know, and personally, I've done research in northern Victoria on a dairy system that produces lots of nitrous oxide and no leaching, and one in Gippsland that produces no nitrous oxide directly and produces lots of leaching. And so what we've got in these calculators is a rude average that says, on average, when you add up all the dairy farms across Victoria, you get to the emission factor. But you can be 100% out on any one particular farm. So it's a true statement to say the inventory method and the calculators are generally right, but quite specifically wrong. Like I said, we would love to get to a day where it's a more dynamic modeling approach. But at the moment, in terms of carbon accounting and the national standard, we stuck with alignment with the inventory. So your agronomist is not wrong. You know, the sugar industry, for example, has one emission factor, 1.99%, I think. And yet the emission on a sandy soil can be 0.5. On a organic peat soil is going to be 7. That's within one industry over 1,000 kilometers north to south. So yeah, quite a challenge there. Mandy, do you believe some of the microbial soil additives being promoted to fix carbon are likely to increase overall carbon or just speeding up the process? Yeah, look, I've got to be a little guarded in what I say, but generally I end up not being guarded at all. I use the analogy of our soils and the rumen of an animal have been around for 50 million years in competitive evolution to come up with a stable microbial composition that have sorted out all the competitive hierarchy already. You can't come along with a magical vial of potion and add it to that soil and expect it to radically transform the processes that have been stable for a long time. You'd need to know that you had some microbe on steroids. So inherently, I think a bit of critical thinking is needed that adding microbes to a soil or adding a fungus to a soil is going to radically transform the soil. My other concern is cane toad. Like, if it's not there already, and you've got 10 to the power 11 microbes per cubic centimeter of soil, why not work with what's there already instead of adding something new that didn't belong there and might actually be the new cane toad we introduce into our soil? So from a first principles point of view, I say, if we can't work with what's there already, when there's 10 to the power of 11 microbes per cubic centimeter, 10 to the power of 11, that's 11 zeros on the end of 10. That's there already working for us. My strategy is it's far better to work with what we've got and enhance its availability and enhance the microbial biomass in situ by just creating more conducive conditions to better soil organic matter accumulation, because that's the food they'll need. So you can probably get that I'm not a fan of adding things to soil that don't belong there already. Also, I guess, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on this, having checked recently, you can find pot trials on these strategies, but you can't find trials in situ in field applications that have proven the change in soil organic matter. So component experiments where you've controlled the microbes in some way can show differences, but when you put it into field application where you've got that massive competition in the background, we don't have any peer review. It's not saying it never will be, but we don't have any peer-reviewed information on the table that proves it yet.
Okay, thank you, Rich. So again, do we have any other questions from attendees today?
I was just going to ask Richard if obviously the soil carbon method's out for review at the moment, and you know there's been plenty of publicised information around, I suppose, how it could be improved. But could you just talk through your thinking about, I suppose, more from a policy perspective around should we be paying for soil carbon that's not being counted in our international accounts?
Yeah, look, a very interesting one, Liz. You know, first of all, we've issued quite a few carbon credits, but they don't get post-deducted out of the inventory. And so it's not actually adding to our Paris target. So that's a fairly significant issue. But I reckon there's another issue in here, and that is the paper that Elaine Mitchell just recently published, which basically says it's 90% of its rainfall. And you can see the logic when you go into it and you say, well, if you're a politician and someone comes to you and says, if we could just increase the soil carbon across Australia's landmass by 0.01% per year, we can solve all our greenhouse gas emission problems. The problem that's missing in that dialogue is that 0.01 is minus 0.01 as often as it is plus 0.01. And we kind of lose sight that actually in Australia's variable climate, in El Nino, it goes to minus. And then it goes into a La Nina, it goes to plus. And so on balance, we end up at the same point. So we've managed to change Victorian government policy on this. Instead of having soil carbon as a wedge in our wedges analysis to say we're going to rely 10% on soil carbon to get us to net zero, the Victorian government has actually used our research to say we'll just hang on to what we've got. Can we just incentivize farmers to hold on to the stocks they've got as we go into a more variable climate? On the soil carbon methodology, I reckon there are some improvements we can bring in. And one significant one that came out of the Soil Society Forum in Canberra the other day, and this came from someone from the Clean Energy Regulator, was could we add, instead of the discount factors that we've got in there, could we have the climate variability percentage of the location that you're at? What I mean by that is if you're in Northwest Tasmania and your CV of rainfall over 100 years is 10%, well, then you apply 10% discount to the carbon credits allocated. And you guarantee that you're pretty safe because Northwest Tasmania is always going forward in soil carbon. But if you're at Longreach and your variability is 100%, then you get a zero carbon credit no matter what you've measured because, well, the probability of losing it in the next decade is so high that is it worth crediting it for the El Nino year, the La Nina years we have, and then just lose it in the La Nina, El Nino. So I reckon that would be a really insightful way of forcing soil carbon projects into reliable rainfall regions where you can guarantee holding on to what you've got.
So as a more of a policy response, because obviously we're wanting producers to look after their soil and they get a productivity return if they do that. So there's an economic incentive already for them to hold on to what they've got. Should there be more of a stewardship option in terms of funding available for them rather than an ACCU funding option?
Yeah, I think it's coming. And because if natural capital accounting include soil organic matter, not soil carbon, then we're across the line. Because actually what really matters, and you've heard me say this a few times, what actually matters is soil organic matter, microbial biomass. If what you're measuring and rewarding is microbial biomass, then we're all on a good wicket. If it's just soil carbon, then that's a huge risk. So I wonder whether the move out of carbon credits in this area into natural capital accounting will kind of self-solve because a soil with higher soil organic matter has higher biodiversity and therefore is part of your biodiversity signal. So that's where I would be headed. Can we incentivize soil microbial biomass, for example?
Thank you.
I think we're on the same page there. Scott asked, does the need to focus on the existing microbiome of the soil lend itself to increase our focus on reintroducing native pre-clearing ecosystem-specific pasture species into our pasture mix? Interesting question. Inherently, you'd say, yes, there is something there. The problem is the native... There was this misnomer back in the day when original land clearing took place that nothing in the grasslands of Australia was of use. And so we had this philosophy that everything in the tropics had to be replaced by African species and everything in the temperates had to be replaced by European species. And what we lost out in the process is not investing in what we had that was more resilient than what we took out. What we had was more resilient than what we brought in. And this is starting to play out in some of our research on the future of ryegrass, because some of what we've published is show that ryegrass underpinning the Victorian dairy industry is dead by 2050. So hang on, should we be putting more research into breeding ryegrass, or should we just cut our losses and invest in a more resilient species for the dairy industry? You could see that playing out in Themida, for example, kangaroo grass. It grows in Hobart and it grows in the Kimberley. It grows in Cape Town and grows in the Middle East. If we had invested in that instead of buffalo grass, we might be far better off in interior Australia, and the hills of Alice Springs might not be taken over by an invasive grass, but would be more occupied by a native grass with equal attribute. So I'm probably not answering your question about the microbiome, but there is evidence that some of these native species did have natural nitrification inhibitor exudates in their roots, for example. You could do some searching on brachyriolone, which is an exudate of the root of Brachyria that manages the nitrogen cycle. So could we start? Yeah, I think I'm answering your question, Scott, about Themida and Microlina. Microlina is probably a little bit further off because it's not nearly as... It's got a long way before it becomes a productive species, but Danthonia, Themida would be great candidates. And if you think of the investment we've put into imported grasses, if we'd put those into Mitchell grass, Themida, and Danthonia, we'd probably be equally ahead.
Okay, we're going to another 20 minutes or so. If we choose to use it for questions, and if there are any more, please bring them up.
You probably, Scott, you probably got the idea while people are thinking about a question that I'm quite passionate about this Themida story, because there's no other grass species I know of that can live in Hobart and live in the Kimberley, live in Cape Town and live in the Middle East. And if you think about the genetic diversity of that species under a future climate, there's almost no climate we can give it that would get rid of it. Whereas perennial ryegrass, you shift it 0.5 degree and it's gone. So in terms of a future climate and resilience, we should be looking at these bigger gene pools that exist in native species that can adapt to multiple ecotypes.
All right, so if that's it with questions, then we'll wrap up. So just one last final call. Are there any more? Okay, well, we'll do a wrap up then. So thank you for joining us today for our final grantee webinar. The other two that we've brought to you have been quite well received, and DQ's provided some very positive feedback to us about how you guys appreciated the content. So it's nice to know that we have been able to provide you with some pertinent and useful information. As we mentioned before, we do hope that the information from all the webinars that we've brought you, you'll be able to use in your work with farmers and land managers and supporting your role as trustees, as DQ's trusted advisors. And you can always go back to the recordings of these 3 webinars. The webinar from today will be available through DQ over the next day or two. And as mentioned previously as well, if you do have any other questions, then please direct them through your grantee organisation to DQ, and we will do our best to get back to you in the limited time that we have left, to provide you with a meaningful and useful response for you. So on behalf of the University of Melbourne, we'd like to thank DQ for their ongoing support of the Carbon Farming Outreach Program, and thank you guys for attending today. But before we sign off, I'll just see if there's anything that Zoe from DQ would like to add, or any of our own team at the university. It's been a fantastic program to be involved with. I feel very privileged for being able to coordinate and lead this program within the university and interfacing with DQ. So from me personally, thank you to everyone who's attended our webinars and made use of the training package that we've developed for you and the training guide. Yeah, so DQ, if there's anything Zoe or any of the other members would like to bring forward, please do, and then I'll give our team a chance to chime in as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ross. Yeah, again, just reiterate, it's been really useful, and I think there's been some fantastic questions and some really good feedback. So I think they've been really well received, and thanks again to Richard for all his work on these two. And again, if you've got any other follow-up questions, feel free to send them to your project manager, who can send them through to our DQ inbox, and then we can distribute them out to the uni to answer if you've got any last questions. But yeah, thanks again. It's been very useful.
Thank you, Zoe. Yeah, I'd like to personally thank Richard Eckard for his knowledge and support with this program too, which has underpinned everything we've done with the work that's been completed, including the webinars. And I'm sure Tanj would like to take the opportunity too, just to put a few words in for the university about just how valuable this program has been from our perspective.
Thank you, Ross. And I just want to say it's been a really an honor and a pleasure to work with not only the university team, but also with the DQ team and the grantees, and in particular with the academic rigor that's coming through and the industry's insights, but the feedback that we've received, it's always been taken on board and accommodated and included. And so this was one of the reasons we wanted to have, based on the feedback received, that we wanted to have more sessions and training in particular areas for you to develop your knowledge and skills and to equip you better to go out and do more training. So we are very excited and grateful for the opportunity to work with all of you. And Richard and Selvin, thank you for your academic leadership in working with us. And I know I've pushed you hard on many levels, as well as to Ross for your dedication on the program over this past 18 months. So really appreciate it. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to work with you. Ross?
Thanks, everyone. I'll echo that. Rich and Selman have been the dynamic duo who have really sat behind this and moved along and kept us on track. So we feel that we've developed a quality product, and we hope you guys are able to benefit from its use. And ultimately, we hope that it's the best resource available for Australia's farmers and land managers. So with that, I'll wrap this one up. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending our webinars. If you saw all three of them, I'm sure you understand that there's been an amazing amount of material covered. You've been brought up to speed with the absolute latest and greatest with what's happening in the field by some of the key experts who represent not only the University of Melbourne, but support governments and international organisations in our global challenge to deal with climate change, as we all need to. So with that, I'll say good afternoon to you all, and thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.